Two on each side? That's it, okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have just hosted an informal meeting of the Security Council where the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Syria briefed Council members on the dire situation of human rights in Syria over the last 4 years. The Commission of Inquiry has a vital role to play in investigating and reporting on atrocities, and the United Kingdom is a firm supporter of their important work. This is the 5th time that the Commission of Inquiry have briefed members of the Security Council, and once again we heard of the horrific scale of violations and abuses being carried out against innocent civilians. Today we heard that the government's military assaults follow a distinct pattern. They cut civilian areas off from access to food, medical supplies, and sometimes electricity as aerial bombardments intensify. Then, as the wounded try to leave, they are arrested, as are those trying to smuggle in much-needed food and medicines. While violations and abuses are being committed by all sides, it is clear that the regime has committed the overwhelming majority and bears the ultimate responsibility for the protection of its citizens. The United Kingdom is committed to achieving accountability for the perpetrators of these crimes. We welcome the Commission of Inquiry's decision to share its information with states who have indicated a willingness to pursue criminal investigations against suspected perpetrators, including foreign nationals in the armed conflict. We fully support the work of the UN Commission of Inquiry, and we continue to call for them to be given unfettered access to Syria and to investigate human rights violations and abuses. We will also work for the effective implementation of UN Security Council Resolutions 2191 and 2165, which stresses that parties to the conflict, in particular the Syrian regime, must comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. I shall now pass the microphone over to the Chair of the Commission, Mr. Paolo Pinheiro.
Thank you, Ambassador. We are very pleased that UK and you have shared this briefing. As you said, is our 50th briefing. It's a good coincidence because today we are releasing also the 9th report that will be introduced at the Human Rights Council the next 17th March. I will just very briefly complete what the Ambassador has said, describing our work. First, we came here, and I think that one of the aims of this report that has a new structure, because it's a sort of overview chronology of the conflict itself and our 3.5 years of work. And then is to call attention that what is happening in Syria, the horrific things are not only being perpetrated by the two terrorist groups, as the Security Council has defined, so-called ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, but it's very important not to forget the human rights violations, the war crimes, like crimes against humanity committed by government forces and by other non-state armed groups that continue to be present in the conflict. The second point is, of course, the appeal for the need to end impunity and to make the perpetrators accountable, very much in the spirit of a paragraph of Resolution 2139. The discussion with the members of the Security Council was something very positive. We have examined the ways how the Security Council can be more assertive in terms of realizing this need to end impunity in Syria. And the last thing that I'd like to say is that our mandate is not only to ask for the possible. Then we didn't come here to facilitate the life of the Security Council, but to ask what has been very difficult in the last 4 years, but we must ask for what is right for victims and the people of Syria. We are trying to convince the international community to consider all options for accountability and not to ignore the victims of this war. My colleagues will be able to also to answer your comments and your questions. Thank you very much for your interest.
We'll take some questions, but as we have the commissioners here, I'd be grateful if you could keep your questions to Syria. My ambassador is happy to talk about other issues informally after this, but for stakeout, we can stick to Syria. James.
Can I ask you about your lists of perpetrators and your consideration about whether to publish those lists? What sort of impact, if you decide to publish, could that have?
To date, we have prepared 4 lists which have been submitted to the UN High Commission for Human Rights for safekeeping in the safe. And those lists cover a variety of alleged perpetrators from different groups. Secondly, to date, we have not revealed the names because we consider that the issue of due process of law has to be borne in mind. Thirdly, we are now preparing the 5th list. And this is the key list where we will be consolidating some names as well. The final point is that we are also considering today, this month and next month, the pros and cons of whether or not to release the list. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. It's horrific crimes that you have revealed in this. Following up on James's question, will you be recommending to the Human Rights Council on March 17th to reveal these names? What is your view of that? And then to Ambassador Lyle Grant, does the Security Council must they approve an ad hoc tribunal as they are as one of their options in the report?
That is, these decisions, we don't have to ask permission of the Human Rights Council or any other body to publish the names. It's just our consideration that will define that. What we share with the Security Council is in what conditions the release of these names can be of some use, because just to release the names without any follow-up, we don't think that is very constructive.
On the question of the ad hoc tribunal, my understanding is the Security Council would need to mandate that if an ad hoc tribunal was to be set up to prosecute human rights abuses in Syria.
And just as a follow-up on the UK or other countries, do you see the proposal to have universal jurisdiction applied in national courts as something feasible in terms of the foreign terrorist fighters?
Well, that is certainly something that we as the United Kingdom are prepared to look at, but frankly, our first preference would be jurisdiction by the International Criminal Court. We have long supported the fact that the level of abuse and violations of human rights in Syria is such that it is absurd that the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction and is not investigating. As you know, we proposed such a referral by the Security Council in May last year, and unfortunately that was vetoed. But that is an issue that I think the Security Council will need to come back to.
Just to clarify, you're considering releasing the names on these lists. How many names are you considering releasing? And if you do decide to release them, will you release them on March 17 at the Human Rights Council?
We've responded to your wise question already. We are considering the pros and cons of whether or not to release the list. But there will be a 5th list in any case next month for the Human Rights Council. And the list covers all actors.
But you're considering to release the list on March 17?
We're considering pros and cons.
But the idea would be to release it on March 17?
We have not said we're going to release publicly the names, but there will be a confidential list subject to the consideration of whether or not to release the names ultimately.
And you have to understand that we have to keep the suspense. We cannot share the number of names in those lists.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Obviously, in speed reading the report as it was released, the government, al-Nusra, and Daesh are the three main headlines. But I wanted, can any of you speak to violations by either the Kurdish forces, by the forces that are now going to be trained, some of them incorporated and trained by the U.S. and Turkey, and even by the air campaign? Did you study impacts of these, and are any of these three that I just named on your lists?
Well, we cover the violations of all sides in regard to what's happening in Syrian territory. And as you have said, we cover the authorities, the government side. We cover their colleagues, so to speak. We cover the non-government, non-state armed groups in their variety. And you've said already al-Nusra and ISIS and other groups. And we cover the Kurds as well. And one recurrent issue pertaining to all sides is the use of child soldiers. Children are being abused by all sides in their various manifestations. And what is very worrying over the past years is that children, particularly under ISIS, are being used as killers, as executioners, and as assassins through suicide bombing. And these abhorrent practices must be stopped, and child protection must be a very primordial concern in our considerations. Thank you.
A question for the ambassador. Does the UK support the publication of this list of names? And can you comment at all on whether there's consensus on the Council for the publication of these names?
This issue did come up in the meeting that we've just had, but it is the clear view of the Council members that the question of publication of the names or not is a question for the Commission of Inquiry, not for the Security Council.
On the chemical weapons, in one of the paragraphs in your report, you say that the chemical weapons that were used in Syria are the government's weapons. Do you have evidence on that or information? Can you make it clear, please?
In our recent reports, two types of chemical weapons. Number one, the sarin-related chemical weapons, and more recently, chlorine attacks. In regard to the sarin, in our earlier report, we said that we had grounds to believe that the sarin came from a government stockpile. But we were not and are not in a position to say who the perpetrators were or are. And likewise, in regard to the chlorine attacks, the chlorine was dropped by government helicopters in recent times. And we are not in a position to say who the perpetrators are, even though we do identify the attacks. Thank you.
Ambassador, a question. Given the divisions on the Security Council over the issue of accountability, how hopeful are you that there could be progress on any of the options that the Commission is putting forward?
Well, the divisions of the Security Council are well known, and they've lasted for 4 years, most unfortunately, because we believe that earlier united action by the Security Council could have brought a stop to this conflict many years ago and many hundreds of thousands of deaths ago. However, we hope that there will be a greater unity in the future. All the Council is united in its concerns about terrorism. Now, the Commission have made very clear that terrorism is a byproduct of the crisis. It is not the cause of the crisis. It is not the heart of the Syrian crisis. Nonetheless, the fact that there is a greater degree of agreement around the Council table on that, the fact that no one disagrees about the abuses that are being perpetrated by all sides, there may be a chance that the Council would be prepared to refer the situation to the ICC. I cannot pretend to be optimistic, but we will certainly look to see whether there could be unanimity on that issue this time, as there wasn't 9 months ago when we tried. Thank you.
Yes. I want to tell you that the Commission is here again. It is the 5th time that we are here to ask justice for the victims. We are investigating. We are doing a lot of work, but is no follow-up. No follow-up. And an immense amount, an immense package of crimes are committed daily in Syria, and nobody, the Security Council is not acting, despite the resolution we had. So we are appealing again here before the Security Council, asking for justice, asking that they decide finally a referral to justice. ICC, a tribunal ad hoc, that are the alternative. We put the alternative too, and we expect really after 4 years that something must be done. We hope, I think, because this Commission is doing what the mandate from the Council is, but I think that the victims are expecting justice. And we must not forget the principle, no peace without justice. And the experience gives us reason to believe that even in Syria, as it was in the Balkans, as it was in Rwanda, no peace without justice. So Security Council should act now. Thank you.
Just a quick one to follow up on Carol's. Do you see any chance that the Security Council would approve an ad hoc tribunal, Ambassador Logrand?
I don't think that situation, that issue has been discussed formally in the Security Council, but given the fact that the Commission of Inquiry is now recommending a number of different options for justice for the victims of human rights violations and abuses in Syria, I think it's something that the Security Council should look at.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Ambassador, all the best. So I hope you can persuade Russia and China to vote for it. Venezuela now, but yes, because you have money.
Ambassador, thanks very much. Thanks for your support.
Pleasure meeting you. Does anyone have any questions on any other issues?